Thank you very much, everybody. I assume that everyone can hear me. My name is Ntando Sindane, and I'm going to be the program director or the moderator of today's webinar. Now, without wasting any time, maybe I think I must begin by saying Happy Intellectual Property Day. I think I must start by that. Now, the title of today's webinar is Intellectual Property and Sustainable Development Goals, African Perspectives. Now, we are going to first have opening remarks from our 4 colleagues. The first will be the Intellectual Property Law Chair at the University of Cape Town, Professor Caroline Ncube.
Oh, you're muted.
I think, can you hear me, Professor Ncube?
Yes, Ntando, I can.
Yes, I'll proceed. The first, of course, will be Professor Caroline Ncube, and then she will be followed by the director of the CLIA, Professor Anthony Diala, and then he will be followed by Professor Amani, and then lastly Professor Rema. Without wasting any time, I will now invite Professor Ncube for her opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sindane. And really, it is a pleasure and a privilege to be here today with everyone in the virtual room to talk about this book. It is a wonderful week in which to have the event because, of course, as you're aware, it is the week of the World Intellectual Property Day, and the focus of the volume is SDGs and intellectual property. So it provides this wonderfully opportune moment for us to talk about this. I really just wanted to again welcome everyone and thank you for coming. We know that you have demands on your time and that you've made a very deliberate choice to join us today, and we appreciate that. I paused a bit because I was vacillating between saying good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because looking at the list of people with us, we are from all over the globe and are at different times. And so whatever time of day or night it is for you, thank you for joining us. So what we are going to be doing is talking about the volume. Obviously, the 3 co-editors of the volume are speaking in this first segment. So we have divided up the editorial interventions between ourselves to most effectively use the time. So Dr. Amani is going to speak about the volume, share the ethic that actually drove us in this editorial task, what we were aiming for, what values we were pursuing. Thereafter, Professor Rema is going to speak a bit more about the objectives of the volume, what we wanted to do, how we went about doing so. He will speak at a bit more length about the volume. And as the 3rd editor and the co-host of this event, I'm going to limit then my interventions to just talking about the panelists who are here in the room with us, because my co-editors will deal with the rest of it. You will soon hear that the volume is quite a massive one, 28 chapters, more than 30 contributors, and so what we did was to divide it into a third, and then each one of us try and take primary responsibility for the third. So the third that I was responsible for included colleagues in my time zone, which would be Africa-based colleagues and colleagues based in the UK and some parts of the US that were able to align better with us. So you will have some of those speakers speaking today, and I'm not going to tell you what their chapters say because they're each brilliant and they will speak much more better than I can about their chapters. But just as a teaser, you've got Prof. Osei Tutu, who's going to talk about SDG 1. You've got Professor Ndlovu, who will speak about SDG 4. Dr. Oke will talk about SDG 3. And it's quite an impressive list. We've got Dr. Titilayo Adebola and Dr. Faith Majekolakbe as well. but we are hard-pressed for time. So I will restrain myself as a highly excited editor and stop here. Just simply say again, thank you for being with us, and I will now hand over to my co-editors to give a bit more detail about the volume. Thank you, Dr. Sindane.
Thank you very much, Professor Caroline Ncube. I did not see Professor Diala, but if Professor Diala, you can hear this and you're in the room, now it is your opportunity.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ntando, and thank you, Professor Ncube, for that opening remark. Yeah, so the Center for Legal Integration in Africa is delighted to be part of this webinar. As you all know, it discusses a very important book, and I was especially excited by the sub-theme of African perspectives, because all too often we tend to approach issues of intellectual property and sustainable development from, well, I wouldn't call it a Eurocentric perspective, but from a perspective that sort of neglects or ignores African voices. So it's good to see African scholars participate in the production of this book and give their own views of how intellectual property operates on the continent. So CLIA is proud to be in support of this initiative, and we look forward to the presentations that will be done today and hopefully making contributions that will aid the sustainable development goals with emphasis on the continent. So once again, thank you, Ntando, and thank you, Professor Ncube.
Thank you for that, Professor Diala. I will now proceed to Professor Amani.
Greetings and good day. My name is Bita Amani. I'm Associate Professor of Law at Queen's University Faculty of Law in Kingston, Canada. It is my distinct pleasure to be able to join you for this webinar and to also share this pre-recorded message that I was invited to do. I'm very grateful for the organizers and particularly Professor Caroline Ncube for inviting me to share some thoughts about our volume on intellectual property rights and sustainable development goals for this session on African perspectives. It really was both a privilege and a pleasure to be working with the co-editors, Professors Ncube and Matthew Rimmer, on this project. It was a labor of love, and it was particularly enjoyable given the incredible and wonderful contributions made by all of the authors to the volume. We think it is a really foundational reference of a first resort for years to come for those working in this field, with something for everyone to consider and build on as we progress towards the realization of the goals and the 2030 agenda of leave no one behind and start with the most behind first. Of course, such an agenda is one that is premised, one might posit, on a care ethic and a recognition of the need towards inclusivity, which may be sensibly seen as at odds with intellectual property rights, given the commitment within these rights to the exclusion thesis, so as rights of exclusion, as well as the exclusivities by which such rights are enjoyed, given both the conditions precedent for rights acquisitions, but also implicating their enforcements in different contexts. So one might look at this volume as building on the incredible literature that pre-existed it on intellectual property rights as trade related, but also on intellectual property rights as human rights related, with law and policy efforts focusing on the necessary limits to such rights, user rights, and considerations of recognizing such rights for their dual identity as public goods and intangibles to which they are attached. So whether we are talking about access to essential medicines or we are talking about access to knowledge goods, education, and access to copyrighted materials in that context, or whether we're thinking about poverty reduction and intellectual property rights as wealth generation, so areas on which you will hear in today's webinar. The 17 goals are very much understood to be indivisible and requiring an attention to their advancement from a human rights perspective simultaneously to achieve the goals as set out and committed to by the UN membership. There are, of course, chapters in this volume that focus more explicitly on the reduction or elimination of inequalities, including my own chapter on SDG 10, which is to reduce inequalities within and among countries. My Canadian colleagues, Professor Craig's chapter on SDG 5, which is dedicated to gender equality, and Professors Tawfik and Valiente on SDG 9 and how to make innovation more gender inclusive. These conversations do give explicit treatment to addressing inequalities, but at their core, we can appreciate all of the collection as one in which the importance of equality is underscored, whether it is in discussing the uptake and utility of TRIPS flexibilities, or it is in fact in looking beyond internal law and policy reforms towards more blue sky solutions for the realization of greater futures for all. So the book very much is focused on not only potential internal reforms in terms of uptake and intellectual property rights law and policy, nuancing to meet objectives of development depending on the context, but also to consider more radical approaches, whether that is with a pandemic treaty or the existing success with the Marrakesh Treaty towards the realization of better futures for all. We also, I just want to close by saying, really, in terms of our own ethic, want to espouse and promote Bell Hooks, so Black feminist Bell Hooks' perspective on the love for the stranger and how loving it is through loving practice that we can start to build effective communities from wherever we are. Ostensibly, the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda seek to do just that. They indicate that intention. Moreover, as David Nabarro, former special advisor to the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda and climate change, had said, the key to unlocking and advancing the UN global goals is love. He wrote, there is an unwritten 18th Sustainable Development Goal that is about love and joy, and it infuses all others. So what he characterizes as SDG 0 is considered to be the heart of the rainbow-colored wheel, representing the SDGs, and it compels us to ask, as he posits, what would our economies look like if their success were not only measured by the material wealth that is created, but by how much joy and love are generated. And so really what Nabarro invites us to do is to consider the joy of improving the living conditions of all the members of our human and non-human families, including with regard to the additional pillars for the SDGs of environment and social relations in addition to the economy, and to consider therefore the implication on the biosphere and various non-human actors and agents living in and along with nature. So as co-editors of this volume, we think that such an approach would go a long way to reducing the inequalities fundamentally at the heart of achieving the SDGs. The 2030 Agenda is people-centered. It is designed to be transformative as an agenda, and it will require, as Nabarro posits, a mindset change. So we close our volume, and I close my message today with an invitation for blue sky solutions, an invitation towards radical collaboration and new and imaginative ways of thinking towards greater change, and to adopt, as Bell Hooks suggests, love as an ethic informing all public policy. I look forward to today's conversations and learning more from all of you, and may we always translate our inspired thinking into inspired action towards more equitable, lived, and loving realities. Much love to you all and best wishes to this end. Thank you. Greetings and good day. My name is Amani. I'm Associate Professor.
Hi, I'm Professor Matthew Rimmer. I am a Professor of Intellectual Property and Innovation Law at the QT Faculty of Business and Law in Brisbane, Australia. As is normally the custom in Australia, I'd like to pay my respects to the Indigenous owners of the land and waters of which I am based, which is the Turrbal and Yugara peoples. Which I think is kind of particularly important given the significance of Indigenous intellectual property to our particular project. I was the lead editor for the Elgar Companion to Intellectual Property and the Sustainable Development Goals. I was ably assisted by my co-editors Amani and Carolyn Ncube. We had a very kind of particular ambition in terms of putting together the collection. We were keen to kind of cover all of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals in the collection. We were also intent on cutting across a wide array of different forms of intellectual property. We were also keen for there to be a diverse array of contributors from a wide array of different jurisdictions. And really those objectives were partly a response to some of our concerns with some of the existing literature in relation to intellectual property and development. Some of it was very mono-focused on intellectual property and the Sustainable Development Goal, just looking at innovation. Sometimes the field was very kind of dominated by a select set of topics like access to knowledge, access to medicines and technology transfer, and sometimes some other topics didn't necessarily get the coverage that they were due. There was also a bit of a kind of a transatlantic bias in the publishing. So often there were a lot of papers from the United States on sustainable development. There was kind of quite a significant amount of literature in the European Union on sustainable development. Some of the Nordic countries had a very kind of strong interest in sustainability as well. But we were kind of keen to shift the geographical focus away from those territories in terms of the collection. So the work in many ways was informed by the contributions of the editors. Each editor really took control of a third of the collection in terms of its topics and tried to put together a list of contributors to tackle particular topics. So I was really focused on contributors in the Asia Pacific and Australia and New Zealand. I also tended to have oversight of those papers, really looking at some of the environmental dimensions of sustainable development. Amani was really focused on the Americas and also had a focus on inequality and human rights. Karen Ncube took command of looking at intellectual property and sustainable development in various African nations and also in some European states as well. And she focused in particular upon some of the sustainable development goals that were kind of focused upon human health and science and technology. But really we worked as a kind of collective team in terms of bringing that together. We held some workshops and then we went through a number of drafts following on those workshops. And in the end, from 2022 to 2024, finally came up with the final collection, which is over 700 pages and has 30 plus contributors. I was kind of particularly happy that there was a strong focus on South Africa in the collection, much thanks to Carolyn's efforts. When I was an undergraduate student, I kind of visited Cape Town for a debating tournament. I was kind of very interested in legal developments that were happening in South Africa at that time. And then, of course, there was the kind of great controversy over the world's largest pharmaceutical companies suing the South African government over the provision of access to essential medicines from India to try to deal with HIV/AIDS. There was a kind of a huge public uproar about that action, and in the end, the drugs companies withdrew their action. But I think that moment was a really interesting kind of flashpoint in terms of intellectual property, sustainable development, and access to essential medicines, and has certainly kind of resonated, particularly with the more recent COVID crisis, in which there were lots of concerns about vaccine nationalism, inequalities in terms of the distribution of vaccines and diagnostics and treatments, and kind of concerns about intellectual property kind of being a barrier to access potentially to CLIA technologies. South Africa, I guess, has also been really important in terms of some of the debates over copyright law and access to knowledge. And that has certainly been a particular case in relation to disability rights. So I think one of the most interesting chapters in the collection involves the Australian academic Professor Paul Harper, who is blind, writing about the South African dispute over copyright law and disability rights in the courts, and kind of thinking about the larger significance of that action. There's also, I guess, been a really important contribution of South African law to trademark law and debates over freedom of speech. I can remember seeing Albie Sachs kind of talk about the very important Black Label case, in which there was a debate over a kind of a culture jamming of a famous trademark. You know, there are a number of chapters in the collection that kind of have a look over at battles over trademarks and inequality and freedom of speech. So I think that precedent is also quite timely and important. And also I think South Africa has been very kind of innovative in terms of grappling with questions around Indigenous intellectual property, which is, I guess, pertinent for many other jurisdictions. In Australia, we've long been having kind of parallel debates about the need for sui generis recognition of Indigenous intellectual property. With the new Albanese government, it looks like we might finally have some bills trying to achieve that. But, you know, in many respects, South Africa was in a much more advanced state than Australia in terms of its law reform campaigns. So I would commend the collection to you all. I'd like to thank the editor, Caroline, and her set of contributors in particular for their rich, diverse intellectual inquiries into the Elgar Companion to Intellectual Property and the Sustainable Development Goals, which I think provides a blueprint for further law reform in this field. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best with your webinar today.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Often I would say that we must give the speakers a round of applause, but it becomes very difficult in these online settings. But I wish to thank the 4 colleagues who gave us an opening address and who have also given us a very vivid outline of the contents of the book. Now, without wasting any time, now that we have received a wonderful opening remarks, we are going to have a keynote address for today that is given by Professor Edward Kwakwa. That will then be followed by a panel session. But for now, I'm going to read Professor Kwakwa's bio by way of introduction, and then I'll then invite him to give the address. Now, Professor Kwakwa is an Assistant Director General at the World Intellectual Property Organization, responsible for overseeing the global challenges and partnership sector. This is a sector that covers issues relating to traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions, and genetic resources. He also serves as the Vice President of the African Foundation for International Law, a member of the Governing Council of Africa Legal Aid, and member of the editorial advisory boards of African Journal of International and Comparative Law. Now, Professor Kwakwa is not a stranger to us in South Africa. I think in conversations prior to this session, he alluded to the fact that he enjoys visiting South Africa. In fact, he has relationships with the Denver College of Law, the University of Pretoria, and as well as other institutions. Now, without wasting any time, Professor Kwakwa, you are most welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Ntando Sindane. I should start by saying, incidentally, I am also affiliated with your own University of Western Cape, and I was there a couple of weeks back. I had the pleasure of running into Desmond Oriakhogba. So speaking of that, Professor Ncube, Professor Desmond Oriakhogba, my fellow panelists, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, I bring you warm greetings from Geneva. And first, allow me to wish us all in advance a very happy Intellectual Property Day. It is my pleasure to join this webinar marking the upcoming World Intellectual Property Day 2024. And this year, as we all know, the World Intellectual Property Day theme is, quote, IP and the SDGs, building our common future with innovation and creativity, end quote. IP and the SDGs, building our common future with innovation and creativity. And as always, the World Intellectual Property Day represents for us an excellent opportunity to celebrate human ingenuity and creativity. But it is also a moment when we can explore how intellectual property encourages and amplifies the innovative and creative solutions that are so crucial to building a better and a more sustainable future for all. Indeed, it is no coincidence that the World Intellectual Property Day theme this year is centered around the SDGs. And Mr. Ntando, I should say, when you talked about the areas in WIPO for which I am responsible, you didn't mention what for me is probably my most important area, and that is intellectual property and the SDGs. That area falls within my sector. So I am very proud of the fact that I am responsible in WIPO for WIPO's outreach in respect of IP and the SDGs. It is no coincidence that the World IP Day theme this year is centered around the SDGs. We all know today we stand at a pivotal moment in history where innovation and creativity are at the forefront of advancing the global sustainability efforts. And WIPO's belief is that IP is a powerful catalyst for growth and development. WIPO also believes that IP is an important tool for translating great ideas into impact that will help us meet the SDGs and leave no one behind. Before moving forward on my reflections on the role of IP and WIPO in advancing the SDGs, I should like to take a moment to congratulate first Professor Bita Amani of Queen's University, Canada. Incidentally, Professor Amani, I'm happy to say I am an alumnus of Queen's University, even if this was almost 40 years ago when I showed up at Queen's. I should also like to congratulate Professor Caroline Ncube of the University of Cape Town. I should like to congratulate Professor Matthew Rimmer of Queensland University of Technology, Australia. And I should like to congratulate all the contributors on the launch of your book, The Elgar Companion to Intellectual Property and the SDGs. It's almost as if you had some sort of clairvoyance, because I know you came up with this topic several years back. Certainly long before WIPO, for its part, decided to make the theme of World Intellectual Property Day this year on IP and SDGs. So let me congratulate you for having come up with this topic long before we did so. Speaking of the SDGs and speaking of the theme for this session, I should say, like Professor Diala, I love the sub-theme of African perspectives. Indeed, I do believe this book represents a comprehensive and a very timely analysis of how IP interacts with and how it shapes the work on advancing each of the 17 SDGs. This is a significant addition to the global body of knowledge on the intersection of IP and SDGs, and we at WIPO are very supportive of such academic contributions, which can benefit not only policymakers and practitioners, but also inventors, policymakers and practitioners, creators, and entrepreneurs around the globe. Now, we all know that traditionally, SDG 9 on industry, innovation, and infrastructure has been regarded as the closest one to WIPO's mandate. However, in WIPO, we are convinced that IP helps to create an enabling environment for innovation to take place, and this plays a critical role in the achievement of not one, not two, but in the achievement of all 17 SDGs. Indeed, IP lies at the heart of human ingenuity and progress. IP is what incentivizes innovation and creativity by providing individuals and organizations with the rights and the protections that they need to bring their ideas to life. Whether it's a groundbreaking invention, or it's a captivating work of art, or even a transformative piece of technology, intellectual property empowers creators and innovators to share their ingenuity with the world, while also safeguarding their rights and ensuring fair competition, fair compensation for their efforts. But IP is not just about protecting the rights of creators and inventors. Indeed, as noted earlier, IP is also fostering a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship. It drives investment, it creates jobs, It fuels economic activity across industries and sectors. And it is IP that enables the transfer of technology and knowledge. It is IP that facilitates collaboration and partnerships. And it's IP that opens up new opportunities for growth and prosperity. So WIPO has recently launched a new patent analytics report, which sheds light on the intersection of patent activity with the Sustainable Development Goals. We call this report, quote, Mapping Innovations, Patents and the SDGs, end quote. And the report tracks how patents contribute to progressing towards and achieving the SDGs. Let me share a few key findings with you. So it turns out 13 out of the 17 SDGs are represented by patents. Indeed, SDG-related patenting is growing and at an increasing speed. And that is the explanation for the fact that almost 1 in 3 inventions are related to the SDGs. And here we are talking about 32% of active patent families worldwide. So of course, SDG 9 on industry, innovation and infrastructure leads in terms of the highest number of patents. And this is 2.9 million active patent families, showcasing the expansive scope of the SDGs. And SDG number 13 on climate action, as well as SDG number 7 on affordable and clean energy, show slightly stronger upward trends compared to most other SDGs. These trends, we believe, reflect a growing awareness and consumer preference for cleaner energy alternatives. And in terms of sustainable relevance across technology sectors, all technology sectors have exhibited double-digit growth in the share of SDG-related patents over the past 20 years. Indeed, 46% of chemistry patents are now related to the SDGs, and this encompasses pharmaceuticals and innovations, enhancing processes that are vital for fields like greenhouse gas emission reduction. According to this same WIPO report, European patents filed through the European Patent Office are popular for SDG-related inventions, with as much as 42% of active European patents being related to the SDGs. This is closely followed by 34% for the Republic of Korea, again 34% for China, and 33% for the United States of America, not to mention 26% for Japan. And I'm sorry I don't have statistics for our continent, Africa, but as you might have guessed, I think it's still work in progress for us on the African continent. So we are hoping sooner or later, we will also be represented meaningfully in the statistics. Let me simply say these numbers make it safe for us to say that innovation and creativity are indispensable drivers of sustainable development. They hold the key to addressing some of the most pressing challenges facing our planet. And these are challenges from combating climate change and promoting clean energy to improving healthcare, education, access to clean water and sanitation. And of course, by harnessing the power of innovation and creativity, we definitely can unlock new solutions, new technologies, and approaches that promote social inclusion, that promote environmental sustainability, and indeed that promote economic prosperity for all. Let me also share with you a few examples of WIPO's efforts to support inventors and creators in finding sustainable solutions to social, economic, health, and environmental challenges that have been developed by the sector in WIPO that I am heading. And this is the Global Challenges and Partnerships sector. First, we have a WIPO Green database of innovative technologies and needs. And this database provides a free, solution-oriented global innovation catalog that connects sustainable solutions of needs related to environmental or climate change problems. Since the launch of this database in 2013, the platform has counted over 2,500 registered database users. And more importantly, it has facilitated more than 1,000 connections among network members. Also, in the context of WIPO's work on mitigating climate change, the second edition of WIPO's Green Technology Book, which was published last year, presents technology trends and practical solutions to combat greenhouse gas emissions from cities, from agriculture and land use, and the high-emitting steel and cement sectors. And this 2023 edition focused on solutions for climate change mitigation and complemented the 2022 publication on climate change adaptation. On SDG number 3, which aims to ensure good health, the WIPO Global Health Innovation Fellowship was launched in October last year as a collaboration with the Department of Biotechnology of the Ministry of Science and Technology of India, the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, and the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. And this program, specifically on SDG number 3, aims to provide training to aspiring medical technology innovators to identify unmet health-related needs, to invent health technologies that address these needs, and to prepare the innovators to implement the technologies into patient care through startups, through corporations, or through other channels. So, following from this, 4 MedTech fellows from different African countries will be sponsored by WIPO to participate as part of the first cohort during this year. In the area of traditional knowledge, now I don't want it to sound like a laundry list, so I'm coming closer to an end. The WIPO Training, Mentoring and Matchmaking Program on IP and Traditional Medical Knowledge was launched again in September 2023. We launched it in 12 African countries with a comprehensive practical workshop on IP and traditional medical knowledge. And traditional medicine practitioners, as well as local communities from these 12 countries, were trained on using IP tools to protect traditional medical knowledge-based innovation and products. The Traditional Medical Knowledge Program, in fact, supports the research and development of medicines that primarily affect developing countries and least developed countries. And it substantially increases the development and training of the health workforce in these countries. So by building the capacity of traditional healers, research institutions, and other stakeholders, the Traditional Medical Knowledge Program has contributed very effectively to economic growth and reduced inequalities. Let me conclude by saying that we need to align our efforts to leverage the transformative potential of innovation and creativity in order to drive progress towards our shared goals. Whether it's developing affordable and accessible healthcare solutions, or promoting sustainable agricultural practices, or even advancing renewable energy technologies, innovation and creativity, they do have a crucial role, innovation and creativity, to play in building a more inclusive, a more equitable, and indeed a more sustainable world. And I do believe that achieving this vision will require collective action and collaboration on an unprecedented scale. Indeed, it will require governments, it will require businesses, it will require civil society organizations, academia, and the private sector to come together in partnership to harness the power of innovation, creativity, and intellectual property, all for the greater good. Distinguished participants, together we have the opportunity to unleash the full potential of human ingenuity and creativity in order to create a better future for generations to come. Let us seize this moment. Let us work together to build a world where innovation thrives, a world where creativity flourishes, and a world where sustainable development is within reach for all. Again, let me congratulate the editors and the authors of this magnificent book, The Elgar Companion to Intellectual Property and the Sustainable Development Goals. I thank you for your attention. Back to you, Mr. Ntando.
Thank you very much, Prof. I really was listening attentively to the keynote address, and I think that the persons or colleagues in the audience were taking notes. I was taking notes also in my small paper. If Prof stays with us until the end, we're going to have a question and answer session.
Sure.
And I'm very sure that colleagues would want to engage Prof. And very clearly, your passion for SDGs comes through in your keynote address. So it would have been a mistake for me not to point that out. Now, we are going to proceed, colleagues, to the panel discussion by our four panelists. When I began, I was supposed to start with the house rules, but I did not, because that would make me sound like a high school principal, and I'm very far from being a high school principal. But the four panelists are going to follow each other. Well, I counted wrong. It's actually 5 panelists going to follow each other, but each panelist is given 10 minutes. Please try not to exceed your 10 minutes, because then that will make me a school principal where I'll have to interrupt, and I don't like doing that. But the long and short of each speaker's engagement today will be to respond to 2 questions, really. Question 1 is, which SDG does your chapter address, and which key points does it make for African states? And then the second question is, what was the most surprising finding made in your chapter? Now, before the panelists begin, I'm going to read the different bios, beginning, of course, with Professor Janewa Osei-Tutu. She's an associate dean and a professor of law at Florida International University College of Law in Miami. She researches and writes on topics at the intersection of intellectual property, human development, and human rights. She also holds an LLM with distinction in international and comparative law from McGill Law, a JD from Queen's Law, and a BA honors from the University of Toronto. She's a member of the Ontario Bar and the New York Bar. And then Professor Osei-Tutu will be followed by Professor Lonias Ndlovu, who is a professor and acting director of the School of Law at the University of Venda in South Africa. His academic networks include the Society of International Economic Law, the African International Economic Law Network, and the South African Association of Intellectual Property Law and Information Technology Law Teachers and Researchers, also known as ABLITL. He's an advocate of the High Court of South Africa and runs a limited practice focused on IP advisory matters and corporate law. Lonias teaches on the WIPO Harvard University Patent X course, focusing on patent law and mitigating future pandemics. Professor Ndlovu will then be followed by Dr. Emmanuel Oke, who is a senior lecturer in international intellectual property at Edinburgh Law School at the University of Edinburgh. His research explores the interface between international intellectual property law and other branches of international law, such as international trade law, international investment law, and international human rights law. He's the author of Patents, Human Rights, and Access to Medicines, published in 2022 by Cambridge University. Also, the Policy Space in International Intellectual Property Law, published by Brill-Nichoff in 2022 also, and the Interface Between Intellectual Property and Investment Law, published in 2021 by Edward Elgar. Professor Dr. Emmanuel Oke will then be followed by Dr. Faith Majekolabke. You must correct me, Dr. Faith, tell me if I've pronounced your surname correctly. Dr. Faith is an assistant professor at the University of Alberta, Faculty of Law in Canada, and a fellow at Harvard University's Beckman Klein Center for Internet and Society. Her research interest is in the areas of intellectual property and technology law. Faith's scholarship focuses on the implications of international copyright law, policy and practices for access to knowledge, technological innovation, human development, and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Just a moment. Then the last panelist is Dr. Titilayo Adebola, who is the theme coordinator for intellectual property law and associate director for the Center for Commercial Law at the University of Aberdeen School of Law, where she teaches intellectual property law, international trade law, and international food law. She is the president of the African International Economic Law Network, an expert advisor to the drafting committee on the African Continental Free Trade Area Intellectual Property Protocol, and a senior advisor to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to food. Dr. Adebola is an editor of Afronomicslaw.org, the leading resource on international economic law as it relates to Africa and the Global South, and the founding editor of the Flora IP, an innovative resource on food, agriculture, and intellectual property. Now, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, these are your 5 panelists. I have introduced them. They will follow each other in the order as it appears in the program. So it will be Professor Osei-Tutu first, then Professor Lonias Ndlovu after, then Dr. Titilayo Adebola, then Dr. Emmanuel Oke, and last but not least, Dr. Faith Majela Kobie. Over to you, Professor Osei Tutu.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. I have the tough job, I'm assuming you can see me and hear me okay. I have the tough job of following the wonderful presentation by Dr. Kwakwa, but I will do the best that I can. And I wanted to just say, first of all, that I'm really honored and pleased to be here and delighted to have been part of this book on SDGs and intellectual property, which I think is a really important topic. And in my chapter, I addressed SDG 1, which is, which for me was really something that I took quite seriously, because SDG 1 is ending poverty everywhere in all its forms. And as I argued in my chapter, SDG 1 is foundational. It's the most basic goal, because living in poverty has implications for the basic necessities of life, such as access to food, healthcare, education. And SDG 1 is so critical because, according to the World Bank, nearly 700 million people live in poverty, and women are more likely to live in poverty than men. And of those living in extreme poverty, the overwhelming majority of them are in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. So this is something that's really important from an African perspective. And, of course, all the SDGs are interrelated, but when we think about ending poverty, it also connects to SDG 2, ending hunger, SDG 6, access to clean water and sanitation, SDG 3, good health and well-being, SDG 4, inclusive and quality education, SDG 5, which is gender equality, SDG 8. So the poverty, I think, is really critical. And the question that my chapter looks at is whether or not intellectual property rights are currently helping or harming, and what a development-oriented system, a development-oriented IP system should really look like. And as we heard from Dr. Kwakwa, intellectual property rights are, of course, a valuable tool for economic growth. And this is something that was widely touted and promised with the establishment of the World Trade Organization TRIPS agreement in 1994. But I have to be a little bit critical, because the several critics of international IP have noted the deleterious effects and inequities of our current international IP system in relation to women, the global south, and the poor in general. So, there really is this critique of the failed promise of the TRIPS agreement of 1994, the promise being that it would be beneficial for all nations and not just industrialized countries. So I loved what I heard about what WIPO is doing, and it's wonderful that we have this commitment to SDGs at WIPO. That said, my chapter argues that even though IP policies are not expressly directed at lifting people out of poverty, IP really can make a difference in people's lives, because it can create opportunities, help create opportunities and generate wealth. But as long as the system as it is remains skewed, and I'm arguing that it remains skewed in favor of major corporations and industrialized countries, and as long as it remains like that, it's unlikely that IP is going to play a meaningful role in lifting people out of poverty. And if we look at the African Union Agenda 2063, just in terms of the linkages of the SDGs and the AU goals, right, in IP, we can look at a high standard of living, quality of life, and well-being for all citizens, having educated citizens, and a skills revolution underpinned by science, technology, and innovation. So this question of IP and the role IP plays is really a critical one. Now, I'm just going to talk briefly about, sort of what I go into in the chapter, right? So talking about IP and poverty, and I've already criticized TRIPS and the fact that we didn't have the kind of trickle down that was promised. We've had to have extensions for implementation for the least developed countries, and the widely argued and widely documented statement that really the TRIPS agreement was not meant for developing countries. But IP can really have a tremendous economic impact. Just looking at the US, for example, a US study showed that the economic impact for IP-intensive industries. That IP-intensive industries contributed nearly $8 trillion to the US gross domestic product in 2019, and that trademark-related industries alone accounted for $7 trillion. So clearly there's a way to generate wealth there. But then we saw how the COVID-19 pandemic reignited the discussion about whether IP rights are really helping or harming and who's excluded from the system. So I'm going to skip over some of the stuff because of the time limitation, but really, you know, it's been 30 years since the TRIPS agreement came into place, and we haven't seen development truly brought to the center of international IP, which is really the core argument. And if we look at there's an intellectual property rights alliance that talks about who has the strongest IP protections. And if you look at it, the European countries are at the top of their list, and Asian and African countries fall to the bottom of their list because it's focused on how strong are your IP rights. And we have not seen countries that from the global south really catching up and having sort of the kind of IP systems that, you know, really at the end of the day, you have sort of a Western standard for the IP that's been globalized. So with it being sort of really more geared towards industrialized countries and corporations, more specifically large corporations in industrialized countries, we've seen that the progress has been slow. And in terms of centering human development and taking into consideration things like health and education and all of that, we've seen certain movements, for example, in terms of the Doha Declaration on TRIPS and public health. You know, that was something that made a difference, but the progress has been slow and minimal, with a focus on exceptions and limitations. And I would argue that if we treat IP rights as a tool for lifting people out of poverty in line with SDG 1, we'd really be aiming for a more responsible and inclusive IP system, talking not just about innovation, but what are the other ways that we can develop human beings and human flourishing. Two quick suggestions and two very modest suggestions. One was to restructure the current system to actually include IP protections for cultural heritage. And this is just getting to the TK-TCEs conversation, because, you know, if you contrast with the protection that we have under the W2 agreement for GIs, which is a culture-based protection, we still have the resistance to protecting TK and TCEs, which in many ways would actually align with human development and human rights. And the second thing, in terms of creating more inclusive approach in terms of international law, is really, you know, getting to the educational component and the fact that IP rights can be difficult to obtain. That's one part of it. And so I love what I heard WIPO's doing in terms of the TK and medicinal knowledge program that Dr. Kwakwa mentioned. But not all IP is expensive and difficult. So we really know that in copyright, for example, there's stories of exploitation, the widely told story of Solomon Linda. But on the flip side, we have the strength of Nollywood. We can consider Afrobeats and how Afrobeats have become a global phenomenon. But copyright is such an essential part of helping those artists thrive and generate wealth from their creations. So, you know, really there's a key educational component and the technical assistance to strategically help excluded populations generate wealth, but really importantly, starting to ask the question, not just are IP rights stimulating innovation, but asking in a really central way, like how do we bring human development to the core of intellectual property and make sure that IP is lifting people out of poverty. I'm going to wrap up. So with the last question was, what was the most surprising finding? I'm not sure. Well, it depends on who you ask. Maybe from an academic perspective, the sort of the IP could be good, right? Because I said, you know, from the academic perspective, there's a lot of criticism of IP rights and how IP limits access to health, how IP limits access to education. And so I guess really it's flipping it to how do we really use IP? Like IP can be terrific. IP can be wonderful. It's not just a sort of a glossing over all the bad stuff, but if we reframe and restructure so that we're looking at how does IP help humanity, we can use IP in a way that is really beneficial for those that have been disadvantaged and for those that are living in poverty. And, you know, so really I guess I would say that's maybe that's the most surprising. If you're a critical academic, that's the most surprising finding. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Say Tutu. Over to you, Professor Ndlovu.
Greetings, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on which part of the world you are. I hope, Dando, I'm audible enough from where I am.
You are audible. We can hear you, Prof. Ndlovu.
Thank you. I am talking to you today from sunny Limpopo in South Africa. I'm going to quickly go into the issues I want to address, and let me just share my screen very quickly. Right, I'm sure you can see the screen. Dando, can you confirm?
I can confirm that we can see the screen, Prof.
Thank you. Yeah, we are addressing SDG 4, and my co-author is Desmond Oriakhogba, who is a professor at UWC. We were working together at the University of Venda when the chapter was conceived. And Desmond, I appreciate your inviting me to join you to be a co-author on this project. We are looking at SDG 4, which essentially provides that the goal is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. And we are looking at SDG 4 in the context of Southern Africa. And incidentally, this afternoon, I attended a PhD results defense. And colleagues kept asking the students, what is your sample size? What is the population? So in our case, the population is 16 SADC member states. And then out of those 16, we went for a sample size of 5. And in case you want to ask us why we went for that 5, the reason or the reasoning behind choosing a sample of 5, I'm talking about South Africa, Malawi, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and Zambia, was that if you look at those 5 countries, essentially they have IP policies, they have national development plans, and like the rest of the Southern African Development Community, they also have national IP legislations in which copyright law is covered. And we are in our chapter actually examining, national copyright laws of the affected countries or of the selected countries, looking at their policies and looking at their, national development plans, and then kind of calibrating the extent to which, those instruments that we actually interrogate promote access to knowledge and the realization or actualization of SDG 4, which again, just for emphasis, deals with quality education. So the key points that we actually make in the chapter, which points are quite relevant to the rest of Africa, although we're focusing on Southern Africa and further, a narrow sample of 5. Point number 1, which is the overarching point really, being that you are saying when we analyzed the legislation, we looked at the IP policies, we looked at the national development plans. We are saying the affected countries should adopt homemade copyright systems which support development, and then these systems also promoting access to copyrighted teaching and learning materials. For while this access is made available, at the same time we are aware of the fact that making this access available should not undermine the legitimate economic concerns or interests of right holders. And then we are saying, on the one hand, copyright holders have economic interest they have in their work, but at the same time we are saying in order for us to realize SDG 4, we must then look at access to knowledge as a human right, and then access to teaching and learning materials in the public interest. And then, of course, we zero in our chapter and say again what African countries can learn would be that they should relook their copyright exceptions, in their copyright legislation, and then look at issues more specifically on open access. And we are advocating for what we call a development-focused copyright system. I want to just quickly, again, we are launching a book. We are not really reading a book, so we want to make the presentation as interesting as possible. So the snippets are, we expect them to kind of inspire you to want to buy a copy of your own or convince your librarian to order one. But otherwise, essentially our chapter covers 4 main aspects. We, like all normal chapters, give you the background. And if you go through that background, you will find that's where we lay bare the origin of the SDG itself and how it relates to the rest. And then we also look at the impact of COVID-19, because again, for context, colleagues, when we wrote the chapter, or at least when we're planning it, COVID-19 was a big issue. And what we are highlighting there is the issue about access to teaching and learning materials, and looking at the fact that during the pandemic, there was a teaching and learning revolution where there was a departure from physical classes to mostly online. And then we are actually saying in that particular instance, most of the materials that were used were copyrighted, and the interests of the right holders had to be taken into account. So while COVID-19 was an impediment health-wise, it was also an impediment in terms of access to learning materials. And then, of course, we are then in our chapter, what we consider the pith and marrow of the chapter is the third part, which looks at the alignment of copyright regimes of selected countries, and then whether they are aligned to SDG 4. And then we also highlight to the reader why the laws and policies fail to advance access to knowledge and the achievement of the outcomes of SDG 4. And then, of course, we conclude by reiterating the main findings of our chapter, which then are essentially that when one looks at the countries surveyed, and I mean Africa, Southern Africa, and then those specific countries, it is quite clear that despite having IP policies, despite having national development plans, despite having getting inspiration from the AU agenda, and in the Southern African context, the SADC Vision 2050, the interventions, whether they are policy, they are, in the sphere of copyright legislation, are not potent enough to ensure that those countries would actually achieve the aspirations of SDG 4. And we identify weaknesses, and I'm just showing you on the screen there by zeroing in on copyright laws. And those aspects that I've highlighted in green are the aspects which our chapter actually shows that I think most of you are surprised, because we were asked to say what's the most surprising finding. I know, of course, and Tando and the rest of the colleagues, when you're talking about surprise, I mean, there are some colleagues who have experienced, very challenging situations, so they don't get easily surprised. But for us now, we're looking at that and saying, we surveyed these countries, we see they have IP policies, they have national legislation, they have development plans. But surprisingly, issues like compulsory license provisions, digital rights management systems, open limitations, all those are not there. And I think that would be surprising, that you are reforming your IP space in the context of copyright in that sphere. You are looking at the era in which we are operating. It is actually 2024. Most of those IP policies have been passed quite recently, and really one gets then surprised that basic copyright legislation does not address those issues that are highlighted in green. So we are in our chapter not necessarily, presenting something alarmist or being caustic critics, we also suggest solutions to the challenges highlighted, and we suggest how the affected countries can go about reforming their, policies, their legislation, in order for them to achieve SDG 4. And we are pushing for open rather than closed educational use exceptions in copyright law reform. And there are other countries in Southern Africa which are yet to do, to engage on actually meaningful reform. And we are saying our chapter should then inform the future reform projects that are likely to come up. And then I would just want to say, colleagues, our chapter compared to the rest of the other chapters, looking at the subject matter it actually addresses, and looking at the fact that most of you in the audience are associated with education somewhat, you will find it quite an easy chapter to read, because in there we actually address issues like what is education, what is quality education, what is inclusive education, what is lifelong learning, what is access to teaching and learning materials, and what form and character do these teaching and learning materials take. And then, of course, how then does accessing knowledge feed into SDG 4? And despite these criticisms or these shortcomings I highlighted, we are making it quite clear that copyright can act as an impediment or a barrier to access to knowledge, and then copyright can impede the attainment of quality education, hence frustrating our goals towards realizing SDG 4. Let me end there, Program Director. As I said, my presentation, I want you to be curious enough to want to read the chapter, and we address quite a number of issues. And for those of you that are researching maybe on IP in the Southern African Development Community, specifically with reference to those countries, our treatment of the country's laws and copyright laws, the national development plans and so on, it's quite a comprehensive treatment which you can use for other thematic focuses other than copyright and SDGs and so on. Thank you, Program Director. Let me end here.
Thank you very much, Professor Ndlovu. The next speaker is Professor Titilayo Adebola. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Program Coordinator. And I'd like to congratulate the editors of this excellent volume, Professors Bita Amani, Caroline Ncube, and Matthew Rima. So we're talking about intellectual property and the Sustainable Development Goals, and my chapter was on branding as a tool to promote geographical indication exports and sustainable development in Africa. The central research question I asked was, how can Africa use geographical indications to increase trade and exports? I argued that geographical indications can contribute to achieving Sustainable Development Goal 17 and Target 17.11, namely to strengthen the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development and significantly increase the exports of developing countries through, inter alia, amongst others, branding. My central claims were that although geographical indications have the potential to contribute to endogenous or homegrown sustainable development in Africa through trade and exports, African countries have not maximized this potential for 4 reasons. First, colonization and the artificial colonial construction of African countries disrupted Africa's production and intergenerational knowledge transfer systems, which have remained distorted. Second, the empire's introduction of foreign products into Africa during the colonial era, backed by laws, policies, and trade-related gymnastics, along with the careful branding, advertising, enforcement, and government support strategies maintained afterwards, have entrenched a facade of superiority of Western products over African alternatives. Third, many African countries lack the tools and technologies to design origin-based products that meet the Western crafted GI standards and to build brands that attract global consumers. And fourth, many African countries and governments fail to prioritize and support the growth of their geographical indication systems. I've argued in other scholarship ways that we can promote geographical indications. And I present an I system, so inclusive, sustainable, and effective systems. And I've said that 5 C's towards achieving I systems would be centering African needs and interests, constructing contextually appropriate legal and non-legal frameworks, coordinating the fragmented GI and related frameworks and institutions, coherent value creation and retention, and creative capacity building and training. We have some examples of geographical indications in Africa. One of my favorites, and I still look forward to having or tasting, the tete goat meat from Mozambique. We have rooibos, we have oku white honey from Cameroon. We have about 200 geographical indications in Africa. Although we have the potential of using geographical indications to boost socioeconomic development in Africa, we still have a limited number of registered GIs. And I've said that this can be traced to a combination of colonial disruptions to local manufacturing, extraction of raw materials, marginalization of African indigenous products, Africa's unfamiliarity with Western IP orthodoxies, and limited government support. I've presented one example of a product that could potentially have geographical indication protection, ogogoro in Nigeria. It's also called akpeteshi in Ghana. The ogogoro story shows how colonization disrupted the growth of an indigenous drink, which with appropriate support could have qualified for geographical indication protection and contributed to endogenous development across Africa. Other counterparts would include things like Scotch whiskey that we have here in Scotland. Ogogoro is produced by locally distilling fermented raffia palm tree juice. Raffia palm trees usually grow in freshwater swamp forest. Tappers make precise incisions in specific parts of palm trees and place clay pots or calabashes or other containers to collect their content. The content is then boiled to form a steam, which is consumed after it condenses. Ogogoro, however, is usually unpackaged and unbranded. It is preserved and sold in unlabeled and unsealed bottles, which keeps the production and sale costs low. This lack of packaging, branding, combined with the low cost and easy accessibility, especially when compared to foreign drinks, has resulted in ogogoro being linked with resource-poor people. What can branding do? Branding can create visibility for GI products, but also help to communicate specific qualities and characteristics. Branding GI products could propel market recognition and distinctiveness in the marketplace, which would then allow producers command premiums for their products. Branding is much more than this, but this is a snippet of what could be done with branding. I'm super proud of these 2 young people, Lola Pedro and Chika Akukwe, or Chibuze Akukwe. They are 2 young people that are interested in branding ogogoro. They became interested in producing ogogoro because they wanted an indigenous product made in Africa by Africans to showcase African excellence. And this photo is their presentation of the ogogoro brand during the last African International Economic Law Network Conference in Accra, Ghana last year. Lola Pedro notes that in Lagos, people show off how much champagne, whiskey they drink, but these same people are quick to dismiss ogogoro and other domestic alcoholic beverages. She explains that this paradox reflects how Africans treat domestic products, which was one of the factors that inspired the Ogogoro project. Pedro and Akukwe grappled with questions such as how to transform Ogogoro, an ostracized, indigenously and unapologetically Nigerian product, into a product that people would celebrate and aspire to be associated with. How can people, or how can they make ogogoro a product that people will want and covet. And then how do you then achieve this? How do you create or present ogogoro as a premium brand? And in talking about branding and the packaging of Pedro's, I thought it was just instructive for us to listen to the words from Lola Pedro in the thinking behind the branding of ogogoro, and that's the bottle for the Pedro's ogogoro. So they say that if you see the shape of a Pedro's bottle, it is the shape of the drum used to distill ogogoro in the bush. Pedro illuminates that they wanted to salute and pay homage to traditional techniques, but modify them in a way that is contemporary. They wrap their bottles in brown paper. Premium or luxury spirits are usually presented in boxes. They were told that if you want to produce a luxury drink, you have to put it in a box. But they say we are Nigerians, we tie wrappers, especially in the south part of Nigeria. Both women and men tie wrappers. So they decided to wrap their bottles. If you look at the yarn that secures the wrapped paper, it is raffia, because palm wine comes from the raffia palm tree. The fiber from the palm tree is how they tie everything together. So what are some of the potential benefits of geographical indications? They can increase trade revenue, foreign exchange earnings, promote endogenous social and economic development, rural development, tourism, and it can also help to conserve traditional knowledge. I'll end with powerful words, I would say, from Pedro's and from the packaging and branding of Pedro's. So they say that Pedro's is not illegal, illicit, or local gin. In fact, it's not gin, it's not vodka, it's not whiskey or brandy, it's not inferior, counterfeit, or unnatural. It is akpeteche, it is kaikai, it is sapele water, it is ogogoro, it is heritage, culture, and tradition. It is authentic, it is organic, it is the finest, it is ours, it is yours. Your machete, your fire, your drum, your water, your tree, your people, your provenance, your future, Africa. It's our pride, our power, and our spirit. It is ours, and Pedro's is ours. So that's where I'll end, and I look forward to discussions at some point.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adebola. The next speaker is Dr. Emmanuel Oke.
Please unmute.
We are unable to hear you, Dr. Oke. Can you please just unmute?
Can you hear me now? Sorry about that. Am I audible?
Yes, we
Yeah,
can
sorry.
hear you. You can go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Mpando. Thank you to the moderators. Thank you to the organizers for this invitation. I'm delighted to be able to speak with you this afternoon from Edinburgh. Apologies for the constant technical hiccups, but I'm glad we can hear each other now, and I hope you can see me as well too. I'm grateful to the editors of the book, Professor Ncube, Professor Rima, and Professor Amani for inviting me to contribute to this excellent book. I sincerely appreciate the opportunity. So I was invited to contribute a chapter on SDG 3B, which deals with supporting the research and development of vaccines and medicines for both communicable and non-communicable diseases that basically or primarily affect developing countries, right? So, I mean, diseases affect different countries in different ways, but SDG 3B is specifically aimed at developing countries, diseases that mainly affect developing countries. So it has two limbs. The first limb is about research and development, so developing new vaccines and medicines for these diseases that mainly affect developing countries. The second limb is providing access to affordable essential medicines and vaccines in accordance with the Doha Declaration on TRIPS. Right? So those are the two limbs of the particular SDG I was asked to deal with, SDG 3B. Now, SDG 3 itself as a whole is about ensuring healthy lives and promoting well-being for all people at all ages. And it has 9 major targets and 4 minor targets, right? So the focus of my chapter is really on one of the minor targets, target 3B or SDG 3B. And in line with the integrated and indivisible nature of SDGs, SDG 3B is particularly linked with targets 3.3, that's communicable diseases, targets 3.4, that's non-communicable diseases, and target 3.8, dealing with universal health coverage. So I've been asked to address, for today's purposes, I'm addressing 2 key questions. What are the key points for Africa? And what was the most surprising thing I found when I was working on this? Well, that's how I interpreted the questions anyway. So in terms of the key message that can be taken away from my chapter for African countries, so I wrote the chapter with developing countries in mind, broadly defined, right? But specifically, I think some of the recommendations I make, or if not all of them, are equally applicable to African countries. Although when we say Africa, we need to probably, be very clear what we mean. There are different countries in Africa at different levels of development, but if we can generalize for now, I think the key points I make in the chapter apply to all of them, to a large extent. So the first recommendation I made for achieving SDG 3B is to incorporate all the available flexibilities that states have under international patent law. So SDG 3B specifically deals with patent law and access to medicines. So, and if you look at international patent law, while it is true that the TRIPS agreement has narrowed down the policy space available to states, there is still considerable policy space available to states under international patent law. So the first thing they need to do is to make sure that they incorporate and implement all these flexibilities at the national level. I don't have time to go through all of the flexibilities in turn now, but some of you already know the flexibilities I have in mind, compulsory licenses, exceptions to patent rights to enable things like research exceptions and regulatory review exceptions and things like that. So we can go through all of that if there's time during the question and answer. At the same time, these flexibilities should be borne in mind when they are negotiating trade agreements, trade and investment agreements. So, a number of the negotiations and rulemaking involving international IP standards takes place outside multilateral forums these days. So a number of things occur outside the WIPO and the WTO. So, but it's important to bear these flexibilities in mind when states are engaged in these negotiations as well. So when they engage in discussions related to trade or investment agreements, particularly with developing or undeveloped countries. Now, having said that, the fact of the matter is that incorporating flexibilities at the national level alone may not be enough by itself, right? As we've seen during the last pandemic, a number of countries have those flexibilities in place, but are not able to use them. And that takes me to the second key point I made in my chapter, that it's very, very important to focus on enhancing local manufacturing capacity, right? So enhancing local manufacturing capacity will help developing countries, particularly African states, to unlock their ability to use the existing flexibilities. So even if you have these flexibilities on paper or in your books, if you don't have local manufacturing capacity, it's going to be very difficult for you to use this flexibility. So, and if you look at examples of countries like India that have been able to use some of these flexibilities in the past. So for instance, India has granted compulsory licenses in the past. And they have Section 3D in their law. The reason why those exceptions or those flexibilities are working well in that context is because, to an extent, India does have local manufacturing capacity. Right? So, one thing that can be done, or one way to achieve this development of local manufacturing capacity, is through regional cooperation. I believe that can help to bring resources together, and so maybe Southern African countries or Western African countries. So, but the key thing here is that they need to really focus on this, because this is what's going to allow them to be able to use the flexibilities under international patent law. Now, the first two recommendations I make really deal with the question of access, right? How to access medicines or vaccines. But don't forget that the SDG, particularly SDG 3B, talks about not just access, it talks about research and development as well too. And then we have this phenomenon where a number of the diseases that affect African countries specifically and developing countries in general are what is usually called neglected diseases, and they are so called because the current patent system does not really incentivize research and development into those diseases to a large extent. So the last suggestion I made, the third suggestion I made, was for countries to look at public-private product development partnerships. Now, they are not perfect. They may not even be ideal in all situations, but they could be helpful, particularly in the context of neglected diseases. So that's one option that African countries may want to explore, because the fact of the matter is that the existing IP system does not really incentivize R&D into these diseases, right? So I think PDPs can be very helpful in this kind of situation. So I'll come to the second question to bring my short presentation to a close. So the question is, what was the most surprising finding my chapter made? Well, the most surprising will be subjective in this context, as some of the other presenters have noted. But I think what I found surprising, particularly in my own context, was the fact that the UN SDGs, broadly speaking, are drafted or are considered to be integrated and indivisible, right? So that is at the core of the idea of the SDGs. And at the same time, it also says that the SDG agenda should be implemented consistently with the rights and obligations of states under international law. So this assumes that international law is integrated and indivisible, but that is not actually true. So while the SDGs themselves may indeed be integrated and indivisible, international law is actually fragmented in practice. And the fact of the matter is states usually have competing and conflicting obligations under various branches of international law. And this has implications for access to medicines and access to vaccines, and specifically in terms of achieving SDG 3B. And that's why I framed the key question for my chapter as, how can states reconcile their SDG commitments, especially SDG 3B, with their conflicting obligations under various branches of international law? Another thing that is noteworthy is the fact that SDG 3B specifically refers to the Doha Declaration and the flexibilities in the TRIPS agreement. So I would argue, and as I argued in that chapter, SDG 3B therefore implicates the obligations of states under both international human rights law, specifically the right to health, and international economic law, that's IP, trade, and investment law. And that's actually the lens through which I approached my chapter. I asked 3 key questions. So I divided the main question into 3 key questions. So does SDG 3B itself, does it incorporate a right to health perspective? Does it take into account the obligations of states under international economic law? And then I looked at the options available to developing countries to reconcile, the obligations they have under international human rights law with the obligations they have under international economic law. And that's how I came up with those 3 key suggestions. That's implementing, and incorporating all the available flexibilities, enhancing local manufacturing capacity, and looking at public-private product development partnerships for neglected diseases. So that's all I have to say. Once again, thank you very much to the organizers and to my fellow panelists. And I should particularly thank the IT guy, Denzel, for rescuing me today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oke. The next and last panelist is Dr. Faith. Maybe Dr. Faith, you must begin by telling me if I have pronounced your surname correctly. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sindani. It's Faith Majekolagbe. Thank you, Professor Ncube and Dr. Desmond, for inviting me to join this panel, and thank you also for inviting me to contribute to this excellent book. So I have 2 questions before me today. One, which SDG does my chapter address, and which key points does it make for African states, and what was the most surprising finding my chapter made? So my chapter addresses SDG 16 and SDG 17. SDG 16 deals with strong institutions, creating strong institutions for the actualization of the Sustainable Development Goals, recognizing that institutions play a significant role in ensuring that the Sustainable Development Goals are actualized. And SDG 17 talks about partnership for the goals. So partnership both between institutions and individuals, bringing all stakeholders together, knowing that we all need to work together towards actualizing the Sustainable Development Goals. So my chapter looks at both SDGs in the context of the World Intellectual Property Organization. In particular, I look at the role of the World Intellectual Property Organization in the SDGs. And so I'm going to extrapolate some of the findings as it relates to the World Intellectual Property Organization to African states. So although I looked at WIPO, African states, including their legislative institutions, national intellectual property offices, and regional intellectual property organizations, I have a lot to learn from some of the points that arose in the context of that chapter. One of the things I emphasized in my chapter is the need to promote balanced intellectual property systems. If intellectual property must promote and facilitate the actualization of the SDGs. Now, I noticed, and a lot of academics have noticed, that the World Intellectual Property Organization sort of takes a narrowed view to the linkage or the nexus between intellectual property and the Sustainable Development Goals. In most cases, the World Intellectual Property Organization emphasizes the benefits of intellectual property to the actualization of the SDGs. But I have argued that an assessment of the linkage between intellectual property and the SDGs must include both a benefit and a cost analysis. Like Professor Osei-Tutu noted, even though intellectual property does foster and enable innovation and creativity, that's an incomplete view of what intellectual property rights do, of the role of intellectual property rights. There are other instruments within the intellectual property arsenal that must also be emphasized beyond exclusive rights. Mechanisms like limitations and exceptions, like flexibilities, must be harnessed and deployed to ensure that intellectual property enables rather than hinders sustainable development. In the context of African countries, I believe that regional cooperation must be strengthened, looking at the fact that we must all partner together in the actualization of the Sustainable Development Goals. There must be regional cooperation towards ensuring that we have balanced IP systems across Africa. African states should cooperate to ensure that the intellectual property protocol to the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement contains norms that engender even sustainable development across Africa, leaving no one behind. So there must be cooperation in that regard, ensuring that we do not just recognize exclusive rights in the IP protocol, but we actually also recognize sufficient limitations and exceptions that would help promote balanced IP systems, and that would help ensure that IP systems enable innovation and creativity and do not hinder innovation and creativity and all the other SDGs are in any way. And I would also like to say that this regional cooperation should not just take place within the context of the region, within the context of the negotiation and the conclusion of the IP protocol to the AFCFTA agreement, but it should also be extended to the work of African states at the World Intellectual Property Organization. We know that there is the African group, and the African group works together to ensure that the interests of African states are being recognized and are being pursued at the World Intellectual Property Organization, but they must continue to partner together and to ensure that the international intellectual property system does not constrain their power to develop national and regional IP systems that take into account the multifaceted dimensions of sustainable development as reflected by the SDGs. And I must commend the work of the African group, particularly the work that they are doing in the Standing Committee on Copyright and Related Rights as it relates to copyright limitations and exceptions, and the work that the African group is doing at the IGC towards the protection of traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. And they must continue to do that work, ensure that they continue to cooperate together to ensure that their voice is being aid in the international intellectual property international intellectual property system, because one of the findings that was made in my chapter is that the international intellectual property system is not really inclusive. Even though each member state has one vote, and even the developing countries are the majority member states in the World Intellectual Property Organization, their voices are not often heard, and the interests of developing countries, including African states, do not often take front and center in the debate and in negotiations at the World Intellectual Property Organization. So in terms of these most surprising findings that my chapter made, I think the most surprising finding would be WIPO's faulty approach to the linkage between intellectual property and the SDGs, in particular its interpretation of its mandate vis-a-vis the SDGs. Now, WIPO considers SDG 9, which is innovation, to be the most connected SDG to its mandate, and in some instances, in WIPO reports, we've seen this argued to be the only SDG that is connected to WIPO's mandate as the Global Intellectual Property Organization. And WIPO also considers intellectual property rights as beneficial, as always beneficial to innovation. Now, as this edited volume has shown, there are linkages between intellectual property and the other SDGs. We have over 30 contributors, about 28 chapters showing linkages between intellectual property and other SDGs, showing how intellectual property rules can both enable the Sustainable Development Goals, but also how how intellectual property systems, when they are not structured properly, can also hinder the attainment of the SDGs. So I have argued in this chapter that WIPO needs to embrace and adopt an approach to development that is consistent with the United Nations approach to development, which is broad and all-encompassing and goes beyond innovation and creativity, while not undermining the importance of innovation and creativity to development. And also, I've argued that while there is a nexus between IP and innovation, that nexus is not always positive. So in the context of African states, we've seen positive linkages between intellectual property and innovation, and intellectual property and creativity. We've seen the Nollywood sector, we've seen our musical sectors, and we've seen that. But we've also seen that intellectual property, when we have very strong intellectual property rights with very weak flexibilities, they can also stifle innovation and creativity. In most cases, we rest on the shoulders of existing creators, and when you do not have access to existing works, because of really strong intellectual property systems, it could really stifle innovation and creativity, and also disempower people. When you look at the linkages between intellectual property and education, for instance, and how education is significant to the development of human capital and the development of those innovative and creative skills, and the way copyright rules kind of affect access to knowledge and access to educational materials, you can begin to see that there could be negative linkages between intellectual property protection and even the promotion of innovation and creativity. And so for African states, it's important that while we have intellectual property systems, and why intellectual property systems are important, we should infuse sufficient flexibilities into intellectual property systems to ensure that they do not stifle innovation. And we should be mindful of the fact that while Western countries could have really strong intellectual property rights and really strong intellectual property systems, and could absorb the shocks of excessive intellectual property rights, we are not yet there. We are not yet in a place where we can absorb the shocks of excessive intellectual property rights. Thank you everyone for listening. I guess I'm going to stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Majekolabie. Thank you. The thumbs up means that I've pronounced it correctly. Thank you very much to the 5 panelists. We are 10 minutes behind schedule, but I think I'm going to allow for 10 minutes of questions and answers. So we will be 10 minutes later than what we scheduled to conclude this session. So without wasting any time, I'm going to allow by a show of hands a question to any of the panelists, but also to the keynote address. I must also emphasize that the panelists themselves are allowed to ask questions to each other. So by a show of hands, we have 10 minutes. So exactly at the hour, we will stop the question and answer session. I do not see any hands. Denzel will help me if there are any hands in the session. And whilst colleagues are still thinking of questions, maybe I, as the program director, must ask a very broad question. In the main, it's directed to the keynote address, Professor Kwakwa, but also the panelists, if they are able to, can maybe chip in. And really, my question, of course, I must start by once again alluding to the fact that in your keynote address, you spoke a lot about the work that WIPO is doing. And I must congratulate some of the efforts that WIPO is putting, and also your passion specifically for SDGs comes through. But in your broad analysis globally, what do you think are some of the state and non-state actions, particularly in the context of Africa and the Global South, that are uniquely inimical to the success of the SDGs or attainment of the SDGs? There might be a few, but what do you think is the main actions, non-state or state actions, that are inimical to the attainment of the SDGs? Thank you. Before you respond, just a moment, before you respond, Prof, I don't know if there are any other hands so that we take questions and then yourself and panelists also get a chance to respond. Are there any other questions, colleagues and friends?
I don't see any for now.
Oh, all right, thank you very much, Denzel. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ntando. So yes, in respect of your question, what do I think are actions that state or non-state actors have taken that are inimical to the attainment of the SDGs? What I would suggest I have seen is that I think it may be, one of it may be an actual lack of participation. So to give you a typical example, I mentioned this WIPO Green platform we have. It's a platform that we provide green technology seekers with those who have the green technologies. We matchmake. And we've tried to get as many African countries or African entities involved as possible. And it's a hard sell. Whereas we have a lot of Japanese, Asian, even Latin American entities involved. And I'm trying to Africanize the platform, because I'm thinking the African continent needs more participation than other continents. It's a bit hard to get the buy-in from the African entities. So I would say that is one of the stumbling blocks, and I still see it as work in progress. It's the same when I mentioned the statistics. For some strange, well, it's not a strange reason, but for obvious reasons, a lot of our African countries do not use the international registration systems as much as other continents use it. So just by virtue of that, when you look at WIPO's, what we call the Global Innovation Index, the African countries don't rank as high as non-African countries. And in fact, I think the highest ranked African country is probably Mauritius. It's not even South Africa, as you would normally expect. So in a sense, I think our continent, we need to work a bit more on improving our innovation ratings, improving our interest in this, because the intellectual property system, at the end of the day, really assists us with economic development. So we need to step up our game in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that response. Are there any other questions in the room? I wouldn't want to be the one asking more questions. Are there any questions in the room? If there are no questions, colleagues and friends, I will then invite Professor Desmond Oriakhogba, or is it doctor, is it professor? Which one do you prefer? I'm going to invite Professor or Dr. Desmond Oriakhogba to give us the vote of thanks and the closing remarks. Over to you, Desmond.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sindane, for your wonderful moderation. One key point I'm going to take away from the conversation today, from all the speakers that have spoken, is that IP is a very important component, for achieving the 17 SDGs, and depending on how it is applied, it will definitely lead to ensuring that the SDGs are not just achieved on paper, but that it affects humans that they are actually designed for. But in my own opinion, I think, and of course from studies drawn from the scholarly masterpiece, the Elgar's companion on IP and SDG, which is being celebrated today, I think that the exclusive nature of IP seems to really stand as one of the stumbling blocks to achieving the SDGs, which is about inclusivity. And so from the policy and lawmaking side, we should then, going forward, be reflecting of how to make sure that, and especially from an African perspective, we should be reflecting on how to make sure that IP policies and laws are designed. We can't really annihilate the existing structures, but as we go into the future, we should think of how to, amend those structures to ensure that everyone is carried along within the IP space, to ensure that IP laws and policies are giving a human face. And that is the message I think that this webinar today and the Elgar's collection on IP and SDGs is, sending, to the larger public and then to policy and lawmakers. Let me conclude by, this is a vote of thanks, so it must be about thank you and not about my opinion on IP and SDGs. So I would say a big thank you to, first, the editors of this book for putting together the very stellar and fantastic group of contributors, and for giving us giving the contributors, of course, the opportunity to tell their story about IP and the SDGs. Also, we thank the contributors for their efforts, their scholarship, and everything they put into producing the chapters that are contained in the book, and also for finding time to join this webinar today and to speak to their chapters and the broader issues on IP and SDG. Particular thanks go to Professor Oriakhogba. This is the second time we would have to call on him. The first time was in 2022. He is always very willing and passionate, to engage with issues that, affect the continent. And we thank you for the work you do in WIPO, and also for always heeding our call each time we call on you. We are very grateful. To the audience, without you, there will be no webinar today. We'll be speaking to ourselves. So we are glad that we have you there, and we hope that you've taken one or two messages from the webinar today, and we hope that you'd join us to preach the gospel of making IP work for everyone, making IP law and policy work for the SDGs. Let me thank particularly, again, before I conclude, the CLIA Center for Law and Integration in Africa, and that's at the University of the Western Cape, and the IP chair at the UCT, particularly led by Professor Caroline Ncube, for the opportunity to put this webinar together. I would stop by saying thank you once again to everyone. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oriakhogba. Colleagues, we will see each other, we'll work with each other. In the meantime, this is me saying goodbye and thank you very much.
Thanks, bye.